The lie doesn't crack with a whisper, it explodes with a scream. Because once one woman steps forward and says, "I was asked to provide a child for those photos," nothing about the story can ever be unseen again. This isn't a gentle unraveling, it's a ripping sound. Fabric tearing, illusions collapsing, a glossy fairy tale suddenly soaked in doubt, suspicion, and unanswered questions that refuse to stay buried. It starts the way these stories always do, wrapped in tragedy, a miscarriage narrative so cinematic it silenced critics before they could even think. Streets empty, a world frozen in lockdown, a couple leaving a hospital clutching a tiny package, grief pressed neatly into poetic language. A secret burial beneath a sacred tree, bare hands, sacred ground. The kind of imagery designed to make your heart react before your brain ever dares to question it. And most people didn't question it. Not at first. Because who questions grief? But here's the problem, grief doesn't suspend reality. And reality has rules. Rules hospitals follow, rules biology follows, rules the calendar does not bend for no matter how powerful the storyteller. Once the emotion faded, people started replaying the details, slowly, carefully. And the cracks didn't whisper, they screamed. Hospitals during peak lockdown did not allow partners into emergency areas. They did not release remains. They did not permit same-day departures wrapped in poetic symbolism. Health codes don't pause for heartbreak. And private land burials? Permits, regulations, paperwork. None of it optional, none of it mentioned. Then there was the tree. A banyan tree, described lovingly, symbolically, except banyan trees don't grow there. Not the climate. Not the soil, not the region. You don't misremember a tree when it's the emotional centerpiece of your grief. That detail wasn't poetic, it was impossible. And once people noticed one impossibility, they noticed another. July 2020, that's the month the loss supposedly happened. 11 months later, a full-term baby announced to the world. On paper, it sounds just barely possible until you actually do the math instead of trusting the headline. Recovery time, conception window, gestation. Biology doesn't sprint, bodies heal before they create again. Even under the most generous assumptions, the timeline is suffocatingly tight. And for women who've lived this reality, who know the waiting, the healing, the fear, the numbers didn't feel miraculous. They felt wrong. And while the calendar struggled to breathe, another detail surfaced. Throughout this supposed pregnancy, she was repeatedly lifting a growing toddler. Regularly, publicly, late stages included. Anyone who's been pregnant knows what that strain does to the body. Doctors warn against it, bodies protest it, yet the narrative marched on untouched by physical limitation. Still, no clarification came, no explanation, no correction, just silence, the kind that lets questions multiply instead of fade. Then came the medical voices, quiet at first, careful, concerned. Specialists pointing out that pregnancy loss at that age is most often biological, chromosomal, developmental, not caused by stress, headlines, or lawsuits. And that distinction matters. Because telling women their grief was triggered by pressure plants, guilt where none should exist. And suddenly, the story wasn't just questionable, it was harmful. Women who'd endured loss read the account and didn't feel seen. They felt alienated. They said it felt theatrical. Polished, like grief performed rather than lived. Early pregnancy loss doesn't look like poetry. It looks like blood, shock, confusion, medical intervention, not singing lullabies in a composed haze. That disconnect rattled people who knew what it feels like. And just when the questions felt heavy enough, voices from the past resurfaced. Childhood connections, long before titles, long before global attention. Conversations about fertility struggles, egg freezing. Endometriosis, a condition known for making conception painfully difficult. Not impossible, but complicated enough to change life plans. And then came the word that froze everything: hysterectomy. A procedure that doesn't bend, doesn't reverse, doesn't allow for natural pregnancy afterward. Ever. These weren't anonymous whispers. Names were attached, reputations risked, and the statements didn't waver. So now the story had a past that contradicted its present. A body that allegedly couldn't, suddenly doing it twice. Effortlessly, publicly, perfectly timed. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, cracks reportedly appeared inside the relationship itself. During the Australia tour, behind closed doors, tension reportedly erupted. Staff overheard something no one expected. A husband asking a question that should never need asking. Are you pregnant? Not joyful disbelief. Not excitement, confusion, frustration. doubt, that moment matters. Because husbands don't ask that unless something feels off, unless details don't align, unless trust is wobbling under unanswered questions. And then, Costa Rica. This is where the story stops being theoretical. A mother steps forward, a real woman, a real name, a real accusation. She says her daughter was hired to appear as Lilibet in photographs, not as a friend, not as a background child, specifically to pose. Payment promised. Payment never delivered. She says no other children were present, not hidden, not guarded, absent. Photos circulated, people compared faces, features didn't match, not lighting, not angles, bone structure. Then came documents, screenshots of official statements that shouldn't exist in duplicate. Same wording, different locations. Kensington Palace, Frogmore Cottage, two versions of reality floating without explanation, and Buckingham Palace said nothing. No denial, no clarification, no correction, silence again. And silence is loud when the questions are this big, because this isn't gossip for sport. These children are tied to succession, to lineage, to history. And history does not tolerate loose ends. Every thread pulled leads to another knot. Every explanation opens 3 more questions. And now, with witnesses stepping forward and timelines collapsing under scrutiny, the fairy tale isn't just cracked, it's splintering. This isn't over, not even close. The deeper you go, the uglier it gets. Because it's about motive, control, and why silence has been weaponized instead of answers. Once the Costa Rica testimony surfaced, something shifted. This wasn't armchair speculation or online theorizing anymore. This was a mother standing in daylight saying her child was used as a prop in a royal narrative and then discarded. And the most chilling part? She didn't sound confused. She sounded precise. Dates, locations, hotels, promises. Details that don't come from imagination, they come from memory. And suddenly, people started noticing something they hadn't wanted to notice before. Where are the children? Not metaphorically, physically. No consistent sightings, no unguarded moments, no accidental captures in the background of real life. Not school gates, not playgrounds, not messy, imperfect, ordinary reality, just curated images, carefully framed, carefully timed, carefully released. That's not how kids exist. That's how assets are managed. Parents lose control of optics with real children all the time. Tantrums, awkward photos, bad angles, unscripted chaos. But here, every glimpse feels staged, distant, interchangeable, as if the idea of the child matters more than the child itself. And then there's the name, Lilibet, a name so emotionally loaded it borders on provocative, a private nickname, deeply personal, historically sensitive, and yet it was taken, announced, trademarked, almost like a brand extension rather than a birth announcement. Ask yourself this: who does that without absolute certainty? Because if there's even the slightest ambiguity, biologically, legally, medically, you don't attach that name. You don't dare. Unless the point isn't heritage, it's leverage. And leverage requires a narrative people won't challenge. Which brings us back to why every question has been met with silence instead of proof. No hospital confirmations, no birth documentation beyond vague statements, no medical clarity, no timelines clarified, no witnesses allowed to speak without backlash, just lawsuits, threats, smears, and a public posture of wounded innocence. But here's the thing about innocence: it doesn't need protection this aggressive. Truth doesn't need to sue everyone who asks for clarity. And the more the walls went up, the more people inside the institution started whispering. Why were staff rotated so frequently? Why were NDAs tightened after specific moments? Why did aides describe an atmosphere of paranoia, secrecy, and constant image control? Why did everything revolve around optics instead of protocol? Royal households run on documentation, paper trails, procedure, redundancy. Nothing exists without records, except this, and that absence is deafening. Then came the whispers about surrogacy, not as a judgment, not as scandal, but as a fact that wouldn't have been controversial if it had been handled honestly. Plenty of public figures use surrogates. It's not shameful. What is explosive is presenting one story publicly while aggressively burying another privately. Because surrogacy changes succession rules, it changes legal status, it changes everything. And suddenly, the frantic need for secrecy starts making sense. If the truth disqualifies, the lie becomes survival. Which brings us back to Tom Bauer. He didn't shout, he didn't dramatize, he documented. And when he says a witness has stepped forward, it isn't casual, it's deliberate, it's careful. because he knows what happens next. Once one witness speaks, others feel safer. And they are. Quietly, carefully, off record at first. Staff, locals, medical professionals bound by ethics but alarmed by inconsistencies. People who noticed things didn't line up but were told to look away, and some of them did, until now. Because history is catching up. Every public appearance that contradicts the previous claim, every timeline that refuses to align, every photograph that raises more questions than it answers. Every document that exists in two versions instead of one. You can't outpace reality forever. And the most uncomfortable truth of all? If the story were clean, it would have been settled years ago. A simple confirmation. A transparent explanation. A quiet release of facts. Done. Instead, what we've seen is escalation, aggression, victimhood used as armor, critics labeled cruel, questions framed as abuse, doubt equated with malice. That's not the behavior of people protecting privacy. That's the behavior of people protecting a narrative. And narratives collapse when witnesses stop being afraid. So here we are. Not asking if something is wrong, but asking how much. Because at this point, it's no longer about one child, or one couple, or one book. It's about whether the public was deliberately misled on a matter tied to monarchy, succession, and history, and whether silence was enforced not to preserve dignity, but to prevent exposure. The scariest part? We're likely only seeing the surface. More documents exist. More people know things. And once the dam breaks, it won't be controlled by press releases or lawsuits. Truth doesn't ask permission. And when it comes out, fully, undeniably, it won't just rewrite one chapter. It will rewrite the entire story people thought they knew. And this time, there will be no going back.